Hey, a couple of things we've got coming up a little later in the program. I'll share those with you. This is what we expect. Prosecutor Grant Loebs is scheduled to join us just after the news at 9 o'clock this morning. Just after the break at 8:30, we're going to be joined by the chairman of the Twin Falls County Republican Party. His name is Steve Millington. Many of you already know those two men. And they'll join us, and they have a lot to chat with us about today. And so I've got really just half an hour of talk time, well, minus news and commercials and the like and those things. So I'll just point out that we'll get right to it. And what I wanted to open up on, well, okay, we won't get right to it. This is one of those mornings when you walk into the office and you look around and you say, okay, what's the top story means? What's the lead? What's the biggest thing that we have going on that we can talk about? And today, probably nothing really stood head and shoulders above everything else. So as I was taking a look at my work prep this morning, I walked into the studio and I sat down. I wanted to load a couple of sound bites that we'll use while Steve is here from some of the Republican candidates for president who are prepping for a debate on CNN. And while I was doing that, I came across a link. I was just checking the weather, in fact, for the area. And I was on something called MSN.com. Now, I'm not a big reader of that, but it's the title page here in the studio. When you come in and you open up Explorer on the computer, MSN.com pops up and it has some news headlines. And it mentions, now this is not officially sanctioned by the LDS Church, but it says Mormon apocalypse prediction has people stocking up on food. Now this is from an author, as I said, not authorized, sanctioned by the church, but who's predicted that the end of the world, or really the apocalypse, is going to get rolling on the 28th of September. That may be why Glenn Beck is so busily working to sell all of those end-of-the-world products on his program. He and Alex Jones do the same thing. They get on the air and they sell you the survival gear, which some of it's pretty good. I have a friend who actually told me everyone should have something like that available. However, some of it is, you could take it or leave it. But I do know this from some friends of mine who lived across the street at my last house. That they, on the church's advice, they had stocked up and stored up on a great amount of water and food in anticipation of troubles ahead. That's not a bad idea for anybody to do that, but I was looking at that, and then I started mulling a couple of things over in my head. We didn't address it because it happened Friday, and then by the time I got back on Monday morning, it seemed like it was a wee bit dated. But it seems to me that there are things going on in this world right now. And I don't know that the establishment media is paying a whole lot of attention to them and probably wouldn't connect the dots anyway because they're not people who really believe in the supernatural. That is, God. And we keep hearing, if they do, they don't believe that God is ever capable of retribution, even though all of our holy texts pretty much make it clear he is. And not she, by the way, but he is. Friday, then this caught my attention just as I got out of bed Saturday and was reading the details on this. Friday, which was September 11th in Riyadh and elsewhere in Saudi Arabia, that's the capital, and then Mecca, and Mecca really being the capital of the Islamic world. Friday, they had terrible storms that roared through the desert in those cities, and high winds and the like, and they have this huge mosque in Mecca, and all of these people were there for the Hajj, which is a tremendously big event in the Islamic faith. And they were coming there, and they were many of them in this enormous mosque in the downtown area, not far from the big rock where they have the huge monument that's covered, of course, so you can't see it because outsiders aren't supposed to. The storm came through, and there had been a construction crane that had been sitting beside this mosque because there was some work being done on it, rehabilitation work. And lightning struck the crane. There's a photograph of the lightning strike, and then the wind toppled the crane over, and it crushed a big portion of the mosque. Many, many people were killed. The crane was owned by the company founded by Osama bin Laden's father. So September 11th, of all days that could happen, associated with the name bin Laden, it was almost as if after 14 years that there was a message from God for the Islamic world when that took place. It struck me that way. And the night before, some of you may have actually seen these pictures, the night before, just before sunset on September 10th, a guy in New York City took a photograph, and it was of a brilliant, beautiful rainbow in the sky stretching forth, and it looked like it emanated and then cut across the sky in a big arc. It looked like it emanated from the New World Trade Tower. Now, I don't know that you read anything into that, but I do know there are people who will at least take notice and say, all right, it's ironic. But the timing is, if not coincidental, is incredible. And then I look at that and I say, I have a friend who's a preacher. He is involved in what is called the home church. And what they do is they just have a member of the congregation. They have no church itself, separate. They just go to somebody's home every weekend, and that's where they have the service. And the next weekend, it might be at another home. And then they move on to another home. But he was telling me way back in 2012, he was a guest on a radio show I was hosting, and he said, I think we've entered tribulation, which, of course, from a Protestant viewpoint is 7 years, I believe. And so his view was we were already into it. He didn't say we've been into it for 2 years or 3 years. He just said we're somewhere in it now. We're somewhere in the middle of it. And I bring this up, too, today because the Federal Reserve has a huge decision on its hands, and I've been reading up about this. It has to make a decision on raising interest rates, which have effectively been zero for the last 8 years. And the fear is, among many, if those interest rates are raised, that the entire world economy is going to start creaking and shaking. And if that happens, we could finally have that day of reckoning that we've been postponing over the last 8 years. And I was telling you yesterday that all over the world, we've seen a huge increase. In fact, the debt that was incurred by people in 2008, which was we heard that people were paying it down afterward, which was a good thing, individuals. Governments, on the other hand, not so much. Debt worldwide is up by about 1/3 since 2008. Now, you take that into account, and if you have interest rates going up, and you've got governments that can't pay, and you've got governments being overwhelmed by this migrant crisis, as these people are coming from, I've said it before, Pat Buchanan has been predicting this is going to happen for 15 or 20 years, and people were calling him a racist and a bigot, and yet he was spot on. I mean, how can you call a man names when he's simply saying, I see this happening? And that's because he wasn't just reading tea leaves or, looking at tarot cards. He was looking at, economic issues around the world and clash of cultures and the like, and he's very studious about it, and he was coming up with all of this. 8:14, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. It's 53. Want to thank you for joining me this morning. And I've mentioned before on this program, there was a book I read, in the late 1990s, called The Fourth Turning, which says that every 80 years or so, that there is a major crisis in the Western world, more specifically the English-speaking world. And the scholars who put this together have traced it all the way back to England in the 1400s, and then even on beyond England and onto the other English-speaking nations of the world. The last big crisis we had in this country, if you want to look at it from a standpoint of national survival, were two back-to-back issues. One was the Great Depression, which really got roaring in the 1930s, 80 years ago. And then World War II, which got roaring in 1941, at least for the USA, but effectively had gotten started with the invasion of Manchuria by Japan in 1931. So you had a lot of these militaristic things going on, and you had clashes of cultures going on all through the 1930s. Secondly, you had the Great Depression going on, and that was, people were saying it was the death of capitalism and it was the end. And then the war came along at the end of that. So if you follow that fourth turning, and the turnings are 20 years apiece, but what they mean by the fourth is every 80 years, the Western world, the English-speaking Western world, is faced with a titanic crisis. So here we are, 80 years after 1935, and 74 years away from the United States entry into World War II, but it had already been raging for quite some time, and our ships had been going down for at least a good year and a half before that, as they were trying to transport supplies to the Allied countries overseas. We've got to take a moment and step back and realize whether or not the end of the world is coming. And I don't necessarily believe it is right now. I had a great email the other day. I get these emails on a daily basis from the Honoré Nguyen Society, and it said that all of those things that were predicted that were going to happen have always been with us. We've always had the earthquakes, the floods, and everything else. So in everybody's individual life, it is always the end times, and you're all going to die at some point. So I'm not really worried about that we're perhaps facing the great cataclysm and that the earth is going to explode and we'll all be done and it will be the end of history. And it's the end of history when there are no humans around, because really, without humans, there's no one to measure what we call history. But we are at a point in our lives where we are facing, I think, multiple crises all over the world. And we've got this economic issue going on. If those interest rates go up even ever so slightly, the growth rate in America, I believe I read this last night from the economist Robert Samuelson, the growth rate has basically, it's been around 0.4%, which is abysmal. And if you raise the interest rates, plus you've got a president who says we're going to get rid of all of our natural gas, coal, and oil and just have giant whirligigs spinning around out in the countryside generating electricity, and your electricity costs are going to go up 4 to 5 times what they currently are, and your healthcare costs are zooming up, and you're going to be pressed like you've never been pressed before when it comes to try to meet your obligations, maybe even put a roof over your head or feed your family. So you've got all of this going on, and you've got people coming from the third world who've got less than we do, thinking that they're going to get what we have. There's going to be conflict, friends. I don't know how else you can slice it. I'm not sitting here saying I want conflict, I'm not advocating conflict, but I'm telling you, you can't escape it. It's coming. And those waves that are going across Europe right now, and you've got a country like Sweden, which only has a population of under 9 million people, and suddenly they're going to have 100,000 new refugees coming in. 100,000. And they've already got a number of people who are living there who have emigrated over the years from the Islamic world. And we're hearing as well that the Russians are allowing these people passage through Russia and then over the top, if you will, into Norway and Sweden, cutting down their travels and bypassing many of the efforts the Europeans have been putting in place just the last few days to try and stop this. Then we are looking at a lot of people out there who are willing to take advantage of this for their own benefit. And to be an American right now, and to be a Western European right now, and to defend those old traditional values that we've had, which were based on a Christian culture, which is somewhat no longer there, but to try and defend all of those old values. We used to call it liberal democracy, the notion that God gave you your rights, government couldn't give them to you because government couldn't take them away. It could try, obviously, but we've got all of these issues, everything that we built our notions of equality and liberty on, are all going to be threatened by all of this as well. And my greatest fear is we're going to see the rise of some totalitarians, even in our corner of the world. And when that happens, the whole notion that we were sort of the end of the evolutionary ladder when it comes to government, well, we might be able to throw that all out. We've got more coming up. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX. 8:20 and 53. Wanted to mention we had a guest in yesterday on the program, and if you were listening, you got a chance to tune in, and maybe it piqued your interest, especially if you were having difficulty hearing what we were talking about, because we were talking about hearing loss and how you can better treat that. Dr. Christine Pickup, she's a doctor of audiology. She was in the studio with us yesterday. She's with Mount Harrison Audiology. They're located in Rupert at 1218 9th Street, Unit 2. And they have a website, too, as well, and an email address you could check out. The email is mountharrisonaudiology.com. The telephone number, of course, 208 area code 312-0957. Did you know that the health of the inner ear is affected by your cardiovascular and kidney health? The inner ear is very sensitive to changes in your blood supply. If you've had recent heart problems or kidney problems, you should have your hearing checked right away. And we do want to point out we had a great time talking with her yesterday, and she may have actually found a couple of new customers while she was in the studio with us, which is, I think, a wonderful thing. And if she helps someone out and it improves your hearing, it was a worthwhile effort. 8:23, Bill Colley with you on Top Story 53 at our studios. And I want to thank you for joining me this morning. Our telephone number is 736-0300. That is 736-0300. My email address is bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. This got a lot of attention yesterday. I was driving home from doing some shopping, grocery shopping, and I was listening to Sean Hannity, and Sean was reading a transcript of it. This is a comment or comments made by the independent but socialist candidate running for the Democrat Party nomination for president, Bernie Sanders, senator from Vermont, speaking of all places at Liberty University, founded by Jerry Falwell, and he was asked a question about racism in this country.
It is unacceptable to judge people, to discriminate against people based on the color of their skin.
Yes.
And I would also say that as a nation, the truth is that a nation which in many ways was created, and I'm sorry to have to say this, from way back on racist principles, that's a fact, we have come a long way as a nation. Now I know, my guess is that probably not everybody here is an admirer or a voter for Barack Obama. But the point is that in 2008, this country took a huge step forward, David, in voting for a candidate based on his ideas and not the color of his skin.
Now, Sanders, a couple of things I wanted to mention about what he was talking, his response to the question from the audience. First, he's right about the fact that people voted for Barack Obama, those who did. They didn't do it. They were colorblind. And so all of the charges that, Obama is, people look at him and they're racist, et cetera, et cetera. You may have a handful of people like that. But overall, I don't think most people look at the president of the United States and see color. I think that if you don't like him, you just don't like him because of his policies. And if you do like him, you like him because of those policies. And I think Sanders is right when he says that. The controversial part of his remarks was when he says this country was founded as a racist country. And he says that's a fact. Now, nobody questions him on that. I think that overall, I'm not Hannity and some of the other people, the commentariat yesterday, were really hammering him about that, saying, how dare he say that, our forefathers were racist. Well, sure, a great many of them were. They held people in bondage. So you understand that. But as far as saying the country was founded as a racist country, you've got to remember that slavery was common all over the world at the time. It wasn't just in the new United States. Number two, I think what people miss, especially among the socialists and the liberals and other people who applaud Bernie Sanders for saying that, is that a great many people at the founding of this country wanted to get rid of slavery immediately. I heard someone talking at a forum one time. A black woman got up and she was saying, there was a time when I was considered just to be 2/3 of a human being. That's the way that white people looked at us. But you see, that's a misinterpretation of what that reference in the Constitution is all about. The southern states said that before they ended up signing that compact and joining the United States, said, we at this point want all of our black slaves counted in our representation. In other words, we want them counted as well, so therefore we can have more members of the House of Representatives. Even though those black folks don't vote, we want them counted as part of our population so we can have a larger share of the seats in the House of Representatives. And up in the North, people looked at that and said, well, if they're not voting, you're not considering them citizens, we can't allow that because that will allow you to run this country. So the compromise was 2/3, that they would be able to take that whole number and count it up as 2/3. And it still allowed the South to have a great deal of sway when it came to decisions made in the House because they were allowed to add extra representation. But it was limited somewhat in that notion. Now, another part of this, when that woman made that comment that day at that forum, a friend of mine was there. He happened to be running for Congress as a libertarian of all things. He stood up and he said, I want to remind you that at the time that compromise was finalized, in every other part of the world where there were slaves being held, and it was just about everywhere else, he said slaves were never considered to be equal or human. They were just seen as chattel. He said, this is the first time in human history anyone acknowledged any humanity in them at all. And the woman didn't quite know what to make of all of that, but she had misinterpreted the whole thing from the beginning. And I think when Sanders brings that up too, he'll look at the Constitution and you go, aha, you see that? They're enshrining racism with this 2/3 compromise. No, it was an effort to try and limit the power of the South Not a good one, but it was at least an effort to try to bring everyone into the union. So I want people to remember that. And Sanders, you could say, was partially right, but I think he got the overall history wrong when he brought that up. Coming up on 829, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Steve Millington will join us in just a few minutes. He's the chairman of the Twin Falls County Republican Party. He's back from a trip to the Air Force Academy. He's got his wings now, I guess. He's very tired because he had to flap his arms the whole entire trip. He's on the way in just a few minutes. We're going to talk debate and Republican candidates for president and maybe even reflect a bit on why we have so few Democrats who want any statewide or congressional offices in Idaho. Maybe there just aren't any out there any longer.